This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with amazing humans who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and I know a thing or two about interviewing folks, but I know next to nothing about job interviews. Luckily, my guest this week, Anna Papalia, has become a household name on TikTok for millions of followers seeking to master the art of interviewing. Anna has cemented herself as today's leading career influencer, and she's put everything she knows about it in her new book, Interviewology, The New Science of Interviewing. It's a revolutionary approach that focuses on self-awareness and how to develop it, and to help everyone master their own unique interview style. Anna, how are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. And so I want to start this conversation by talking about fear, because I feel like fear is a driver in interviews, and I think people see it as a one-sided part of fear where it's the interviewee having fear, but I want to turn that around and talk about the fear of the interviewer, because I think that's one of the underrated elements of an interview, because people think, oh, this person who's asking the questions has all the power. They know exactly what to ask. But as you know, being the experts of interviews, most interviews don't know what to ask or how to ask. So break that down a little bit about the fear from the interviewer's point of view.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, in my research, I discovered that 90% of hiring managers have never been trained to interview. And often when I have job seeker clients coming to me that are full of fear and worried about this process, I try to remind them that they're just human and they're trying to do a job and they're going to make mistakes. They're not perfect. And I know this to be true because I have trained thousands of hiring managers how to interview better. And I know for a fact that most hiring managers are nervous in the interview process as well. Like they're not as nervous, right? Because a job isn't on the line, but they have a lot that they need to do correctly. They need to find the right position. They need to avoid embarrassment. They don't want to hire the wrong person. Whoever they hire changes their team, their department, how effective they're going to be. So there's a lot on the line for a hiring manager. So they're nervous. They want to get it right as well.
Yeah, and it's funny you talk about the fact that you mentioned that most hiring managers weren't prepared to interview. It's just something that they happen. I remember a friend of mine who runs a company had this long-time employee, and he said to her, like, hey, listen, you've done a great job. I'm going to make you manager, some VP position. And the person's like, great. How do I do that? Like, it's automatically assumed that someone rising through the ranks is going to know exactly that job just because they've done a certain thing that they can do another job, but it's not necessarily that. And the training of asking for questions, I feel like that's such a lost art, and one of those things where unless you're really intentional about learning it or maybe just using trial and error, how do people get better at that aspect of it? Because as we've already laid out, it's not as easy as it seems from the outside.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think in our society, we have this belief, this very strange belief that interviewing is something that you're just going to figure out, just like getting promoted. Like, well, if you were good at that job, you'll be good at this one. No brainer. But it isn't that way. So interviewing is a skill that you get much better at the more you do it. And if you have training backed in research and science. But yet a lot of hiring managers and executives believe that interviewing is a lot like dating. Just kiss a bunch of frogs and you'll figure it out. But that's not the case. We lose a lot of money. We lose a lot of time. It's absolutely ineffective. And where else would you give someone that advice? Just don't get any training at all. Go fall flat on your face 19 times and you'll figure it out. Like maybe you learn how to ride a bike like that. But interviewing, where there's a lot of money and big decisions on the line, shouldn't be done this way.
And I feel like the spotlight has really shone on HR since 2020, the pandemic, social unrest, because it's one of those things where, and I know you call interviewing the redheaded stepchild of HR, but in essence, HR was the redheaded stepchild of companies. They were basically hiring and firing. They were the quote unquote bad guy. They only got involved with a company if something went horribly wrong. Outside of that, everyone else just took care of it. So what have you seen, since you've been doing this long enough, pre-pandemic, pre-social unrest, pre-2020, what kind of changes have you seen in terms of, I don't know, the lens which we look at HR? How has that changed over the last 4 years?
I don't know if I can speak to the lens of how we look at it because I'm so sort of in it, but I can tell you from experience that the power dynamic is changing greatly because of COVID. So what COVID did to the real estate market is very similar to what it did to the talent market. previous to COVID 2019 and earlier, most hiring managers, job and HR professionals and recruiters had the power because there were a lot of applicants. So extrapolate that. You can treat people however you want. You can ghost people. You don't have to send emails. You don't even have to reject people because you have this belief that there are 300 more applicants out there. There's a line around the building. And this was this weird dynamic where if you feel as though you're in a position of power and no one's holding you accountable and you haven't been trained, this is a mess. And then what COVID did was it decreased how many applicants are out in the market. And so therefore the power dynamic shifts so much where you can't act the way you were acting before because now you have less candidates. There isn't a line around the building. So now you went from getting 300 applicants to getting 20 or 30. Now you have to behave. Now you have to figure out how to do this thing that for such a long time you were just like, well, I have the power. I can decide. I can do whatever I want. And I am very grateful for COVID for many reasons. And that's one of the things that really changed the talent pool, and it changed how HR professionals, recruiters, and hiring managers have to go about how they do their jobs. Thank goodness. We needed to right the ship. And I'm really glad to see the change happening finally.
That's great. And you joked a little earlier about how people just took the interviewing part of it as sort of like an intangible, like it's just something like it's just chatting. It's, it's like just be nice, ask the right questions. But the tangible part of it, tell me about that, because you mentioned science and research. How does that help fit in? Because you still, at the end of the day, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, you still need that intangibleness of being able to connect with another human being, that the kind of stuff, the squishy stuff that you can't put on a resume. But talk about the aspects of the tangibleness of interviewing and the skills and the data and the research that you use to help folks.
Well, I think what's so fascinating is when I was a director of talent acquisition, I really struggled with the fact that we don't have a formalized language to talk about what happens in an interview. I thought that was very odd. And I had gone to Penn for psychology, and I had done all the assessments and all the work. And I thought, well, why don't we have a tool like this, right? And so when I got out and started teaching people how to interview, I then had another light bulb moment. I was teaching students, many students, and I think all great teachers struggle with this at some point. You ask yourself, why aren't some of my students getting this? And why are some of the students getting this? And I realized that we have this very weird belief that we think everyone interviews the way we do. Like that everyone interviews the same way and everyone believes it, but no one can really put their finger on it. Can't really describe it. And it's just all a very opaque thing. And yet we don't have this formalized language. So that's what I tasked myself with. I asked myself, what if I could create a personality assessment to figure out if there are different interview styles, and then from there, create a formalized language to make it easier for job seekers and hiring managers to talk about their interactions and interviews. I did just that. I collected lots of research at Temple University, and I discovered that we interview in one of four ways. You interview as either a charmer, a challenger, an examiner, or a harmonizer. And each of these interview styles, it really sets you up for different experiences. What I found is that we don't all interview the same way. And your interview style really shows us how you get someone to see that you're qualified. For example, charmers prioritize being liked and they want to make a connection. Challengers prioritize being respected and heard, and they look at an interview like a cross-examination. Examiners look at an interview like a test that they're either going to pass or fail, and they don't go into an interview wanting to be liked. They go into an interview wanting to be seen as qualified, but they're the opposite of charmers. And then lastly, harmonizers, the opposite of challengers, they go into an interview wanting to adapt. They look at an interview like a tryout for a team that they want to join. So you can see how this sets everyone up for different experiences. And we need to understand that we don't all do this the same way. Starting from there, I think it's a good baseline to better understand what's happening in your job interview.
Interesting. And we are speaking about this from the HR hiring manager part of it. But as you know, Anna, the interviews don't stop there. As many companies do, it becomes what I like to say, a car wash. You're going through a car wash and you're just getting peppered with a different person from this department interviewing you. Then next time it's another person interviewing you. So how does this sort of skill and methodology roll downhill? Because we are speaking from the HR point of view, but like I mentioned, the HR person is not the only person interviewing these folks. It's a layer upon layer of layer. So how have you been able to help folks with that? It's just not the HR professional having these four personas. Every one of these other layers has to have one of those personas as well, correct?
Everybody, anyone that interviews. And the thing that I wanted to do that's revolutionary in my book, Interviewology, The New Science of Interviewing, is it's written to both job seekers and hiring managers. That how you interview doesn't change whether you're a hiring manager or a job seeker. That line at the table of who's in the position of power, who can hire, and who's the one looking for the job is just this very strange artificial thing. How you interview doesn't matter what side of the table you're on. And everyone interviews in one of those four ways is what I found.
And we've been talking about the pandemic and how it's changed things in the HR game. But one of the changes we didn't mention is virtual interviews, something that was unheard of 5-6 years ago. I mean, tech companies were probably doing it for preliminary interviews, but most companies in America were not doing it. How does everything you put together with Interviewology, what you teach, how does that sort of jibe with virtual interviews? Is it the same? Are there differences in terms of how you conduct an interview as opposed to from virtual to or in person?
I think a virtual interview is just how you do it, right? You can have a phone interview, you can have an in-person interview, or you can have a Zoom interview. It doesn't really change what's happening. It doesn't change the core of your job as a hiring manager to know the position really well, to ask great questions, ask the same questions of every candidate. From a presentation standpoint from the job seeker, I think virtual interviews are harder because you have to work harder to show enthusiasm. You have to expend more energy. When you're in person, those things just naturally occur. Our human brains are made to understand what's going on in person. Virtually, we're looking at the camera, we're looking at the screen, we're looking at all these other people, and it feels unnatural, even though we've been doing it for years. It's much harder for us. So you have to expend a lot of energy in order to make a great impression in a virtual interview.
And how about humor? I always feel like humor is one of those things that we all expect from folks because it makes us feel better, but it's also one of those things that can make people feel uncomfortable. What's your take on humor? Because it's so subjective, yet if someone is seen as quote unquote humorless, they wouldn't get hired or be an interviewer. What's your feel on humor?
Well, I have to think to the interview style. So if you prioritize someone who's funny, or you are really entertained by a candidate, or you like someone who does that, you're probably a charmer. Charmers are some of the only interview style that would crack a joke, that tell personal stories. They're opposite in an examiner, as, to use your word, humorless would never, ever tell a joke in an interview. And so it really depends. If you're an examiner, you're going to like another examiner. So it really is all dependent on your baseline, what your interview style is. And that's where our biases come from. So if you go into an interview thinking you need to entertain someone and that you should really think of the best stories to tell, you're probably a charmer.
And how about reading the room with that? Because especially if you're doing a bunch of these interviews, it's going to be one of those four that you've broken down. Any tips for reading who you're dealing with? Maybe it's something you can read into prior with emails and communications that way, or like how do you judge? Because for most people, we talked about the fear and the pressure of being in this position, but then all of a sudden like, oh wait, I got to break down. Is this person a charmer? Is this person an examiner? Oh God, I can't handle this.
Well, I think first start by taking our interview style assessment on our website, and then obviously you can get my book to read about all four interview styles. And then you have a really good understanding of yourself. That's your baseline. I'm a charmer, for example. And then in the book, it outlines all four styles. From there, it's pretty easy once you have a really good understanding of these four interview styles. If you get into an interview and if you know you're a charmer and you're in your charming mode and the other person is peppering you with tough questions, they're skeptical. They want to get to the heart of it. They are really putting you on the hot seat. You leave and you're like, I have no idea if that person liked me at all. They're a challenger, almost guaranteed, right? If you go into an interview and they're very quiet and they are asking you questions and not giving you much, they have a poker face, they're an examiner. If you go into an interview and they're very likable and very easy to get along with, and they're not really asking you many questions at all, feels more conversational, they're a harmonizer. So there are some very basic and easy ways to do some people reading, all in my new upcoming book, Interviewology. We have strengths and overused strengths sections, and at the end of every chapter, we talk about job seekers as hiring managers and hiring managers as charmers, challengers, examiners. So we do sections on each at the end of every chapter.
That's awesome. There's this old wives' tale. I don't even know if it's a wives' tale, but there's this whole thing about when you go in for an interview, you want the interviewer to do most of the talking. Is that still something that works today? Or I know we've broken down to the science of who these folks are that are interviewing, but there's always been this adage, and I'm sure you've heard it before, let the interview do most of the talking, be there a listener, blah, blah, blah. How do you weigh in on that?
Well, that's so effective that I teach hiring managers to not talk. So here's how it goes. Most hiring managers go into an interview and they'll say something like, so thanks so much for coming in. Let me tell you about the job. Let me tell you about the company. Let me tell you about this. Let me tell you about that. Let me tell you about where you'd be working. And the hiring manager talks for 80% of the interview. The candidate then just sits there and nods and smiles. And then they get hired. 6 months later, the hiring manager goes to HR and they're like, this person can't do the job at all. And HR is like, did you interview them? No, you just want the job. But it's not going to make sure that you get the right job and all of that. So it's really bad advice for both people, I believe. But it is effective, right? If you just get someone talking, they're not going to ask you any tough questions. But why do you want that? An interview is a two-way street. It's not about finding any job. It's about finding the right job. So you should be interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. And I always teach hiring managers to talk less. Hiring managers should only be talking 20% of the time, and that talking should be asking questions. According to the EEOC, an interview is a test and should be conducted like a test. So ask a question and let them answer. This is very hard for charmers and harmonizer hiring managers because they want to help people. They don't want to watch someone squirm. I mean, challengers and examiners love it. They don't mind asking a tough question and watching someone squirm. So it really depends on what type of hiring manager you are, how difficult this is really going to be for you. But it is not effective as a hiring manager to talk for the whole time. And that's what most hiring managers do. It's the number one mistake hiring managers make. They talk too much.
Wow. And how about I don't know if there's a way to fix this, but what if you're a job seeker and you walk into one of these situations where the hiring manager breaks your rule number one about just railroading, just completely taking over conversation, 80-20 as opposed to 20-80. Any tips of advice for folks that run into that situation where like, man, I don't have a chance to tell these people how good I am because this person's talking the whole time. Any words of advice for those folks?
No, it stinks because you're not in a position of power. What are you going to do? I mean, you nod and smile. You try to get your questions answered. You try your hardest, but you're not in a position of power. That's why the hiring process is really flawed. And then what happens if the interview goes great and they never send you an email, or they send you an offer and then they ghost you? There are all kinds of terrible things that happen in the hiring process. And what are you going to do? You're going to call the CEO? There's no accountability. And that's why a job search is not just stressful because you're looking for a new position and there's lots of uncertainty. It's also because you are nowhere near the position of power.
That sucks.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. And I'm on a mission to have a better conversation about it. I train hiring managers and job seekers to do this differently because, like I said earlier, we're missing out on great candidates because of this weird dynamic, this weird power shift that's being made in the talent world.
And obviously, technology plays a big part in the world of HR. It's more and more of it. I'm not going to talk about those two little letters that people talk about in every podcast interview about business. I'm not going to do it. But let's talk about how technology fits into HR and dwindling those candidates. Because we kind of mentioned earlier that there's fewer candidates, but there's still more than a handful applying for roles. I mean, if you looked on LinkedIn, you'll see something like 300 people apply for this job, 400 people. So you do see it in those situations. So from the HR perspective, the hiring manager, getting it down to the surmisable amount of people you can interview, how is that looking like today? Is the right technology in place to get those numbers down to a manageable, 5 to 10 people you're interviewing, as opposed to having to go through troves and troves of emails and resumes? Like, break that down for folks who are unfamiliar with how it is nowadays in the sort of intersection of technology and HR.
Sure. And first, before I answer this, is a really important caveat. Most organizations are small to mid-sized businesses, and they aren't using these big technologies, most of them. Okay. Only the really large corporations are using applicant tracking systems and video recorded interviews. Okay. So it's a small percentage. But if you're looking for jobs at large global companies, this is what you're going to be up against. Small, mid-sized mom and pops do not use this. So don't worry about that if that's the case for your job search. So two things are happening to whittle down that pack, to answer your question. First of all, when you go to apply to a job, you're submitting your application through an applicant tracking system, what we call an ATS. These are right with bias. There's tons of research on these. They're looking for keywords. They're filtering out different resumes. That's why you can hit submit and then immediately get a rejection email because your resume or application didn't have some of the things that they were looking for. That is very problematic. I could spend another hour talking about how problematic applicant tracking systems are. There are some that are much better than others, and the technology is sort of going in the right place, but most of the time, recruiters are just using these as filtering softwares. Because imagine you are a recruiter and you have 30 openings that you're working, and you use this software to help you whittle down all of the incoming resumes. Now, I have been this director of talent, and you're getting everything people are sending to you. And people often will just blind send their resume anywhere. So you might be getting 30 or 40% of your resumes are actually people really interested in this position and well qualified. So let's set that aside for a second. So that's how you whittle down your resumes. Then you get these resumes, and then you have to do a phone screen or an initial interview to whittle down that pack to send to your hiring managers. Very large companies are using what's called a video recorded interview. So instead of having enough human recruiters to call and do that phone screen, they're going to send you a link that says, do this virtual interview. There's no one on the other end of the Zoom. Look into your camera and answer these 5 interview questions. And you can re-record yourself a couple of times, and then it's going to save your response and move on to the next question. And some of them let you re-record it, as many times as you need, which is awful because some people will be up until 3 a.m. re-recording to get the perfect answer. And here's the thing. If you don't have enough human recruiters to do the actual phone interviews, you don't have enough human recruiters to be watching these interviews. So they're forcing candidates to do this painful, horrible video interview that is really hell for everyone, right? And then no one's actually watching it. These recruiters are fast forwarding. They might watch 5 seconds here, 10 seconds here. I guarantee, I promise you, recruiters are not watching all 20 minutes of a recorded interview, especially if they didn't have enough time to actually interview you. So applicants are asked to do these crazy things. There's obstacles put in their way. Fill out this 3-hour application, and then we're going to give you a virtual interview, and then we might have a phone screen, and then you can actually get in an in-person interview. The ATS systems and the virtual interviews are incredibly biased and just an obstacle that we need to get rid of.
Wow. And I'm just curious about your journey because, we've talked about how the fact that it's assumed that when you are an HR manager, you know how to interview. When did you know that you're like, I'm pretty good at this. I know I'm good. Like, did you have a sort of moment like that in your career where you realized it wasn't like someone that said something to you, but you just had this realization that I'm good at this and I could probably help other people do this?
Well, it was very interesting for me. And I tell this story in the opening chapter, in the first chapter of my book. I applied to the University of Pennsylvania, and I was asked to come in for an admissions interview. And I was a little older because I had taken some time off and taken some classes at a community college. So I was probably 21 at the time. And I went in for this interview, and I had a pretty tough childhood. I escaped my very abusive and controlling stepfather, and I moved out when I was 15. And I started working full time. I had my own apartment and a full-time job and got myself through high school. And I told them that story in the admissions process, not because I wanted to pull on their heartstrings, but because I knew I had to justify why I didn't like play tennis and like have better SAT scores because, you know, I was working and like had an apartment and had to do other things. And the admissions officer looked at me and he said, well, Miss Papalia, you have a tough decision to make. You can wait for the letter or I can accept you on the spot. So I thought, maybe I'm gonna get at this. No, it came later actually. So I went to Penn and I majored in psychology and got some internships in behavioral health. And I worked at restaurants where you really cut your teeth on learning how to work with people, talk with people, think on your feet. And I worked at a pretty famous restaurant and I waited on celebrities and it was just a really cool place to be. And then my first job was in HR and the recruiter was overwhelmed. She gave me a stack of resumes and I thought to myself, they're going to pay me to like talk to people on the phone. And I knew that I was really good at the interpersonal stuff. I knew I was a charmer. I knew I could do all of that stuff. And I just rose through the ranks really effortlessly in corporate recruiting. And I was never trained to interview. And it wasn't until I left my corporate job, started teaching at the Fox School of Business, when I realized, how weird is it? I was never taught. And that's when I started collecting research and realized 90% of people are never taught. And why is this? And luckily, when I collected my research and had my hypothesis, I thought, I'm going to discover interview styles and how to do this. And I'm going to figure out that there's one interview style that's better than all the others. And I know it's going to be mine because look at how great I am. Like I was in HR forever. I know what it takes. I got into an Ivy League school in my interview. I'm the shit when it comes to interviewing. That's what I thought. Really, totally, truly. I really did. And I'm so glad that I was so completely wrong. In collecting this research, I turned my hypothesis on its head and realized that every interview style has the capacity to be a rock star and nail their interview. And I know this because I collected tons of research at Temple, and I found that there was no interview style that had a direct correlation with getting all the internships offers. It wasn't all the charmers. It was an equal and normal distribution. So examiners, harmonizers, charmers, and challengers were all getting jobs equally. And I get goosebumps just reliving that moment, thinking, wow, I was really dead ass wrong. What was I wrong about before? And how biased was I in my recruiting practices? And that ultimately led me to realize the biggest realization in discovering interview styles is that we all think we do it the right way. And the best way, in fact, is to be more open-minded, and that we need everybody. It's not just, I'm the way to do this. We need everyone. Everyone has a unique perspective and it's valuable.
Awesome. And I know there's 4 personas, but I always like to tie things up together with like a top 3. So is there 3 elements that make a good interviewer? It could come across any of those 4 personas that we've been talking about, but are there 3 that come to mind? Like if you say if you do these 3 things, you're a good interviewer?
Practice makes perfect in all things. So if you have done it a lot, you know that you can never really be perfect at it. That's, I think, one of the key realizations I have found after conducting over 10,000 interviews. The cocky instinct I had when I was younger is gone. Now it's more curious and open-minded, interested, fascinated by people, rather than making snap judgments from my biases. That, I think, would be number 1. Number 2 is to be well prepared and have done your research. Go into interviews with great questions asked. And the last one is not sexy and it's not interesting, but it's to conduct structured interviews with everyone, which means ask the same candidates, the same questions in the same way, and resist your urge to have a conversation. Resist your urge to tell jokes and laugh and just make a connection. That's not how you determine if someone's going to be a good fit for your company.
Awesome. Her name is Anna Papalia. You can order her new book now, Interviewology, The New Science of Interviewing. Anna, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was so fun. Thanks for having me.
And that's going to do it for another Forbes Books podcast. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and hit subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila or TikTok at J Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.